Good afternoon, I'm Lesley-Anne and my presentation today will explore the topic of French post-structural feminism. I'll start by providing an introduction to my thesis topic and how this research fits with my topic, and then a brief overview of post-structuralism. The main body of my presentation will be an exploration of the theories of some of the key French post-structural feminists, the most well-known of whom are Julie Kristeva, Luce Irigaray, and Hélène Cixous. These were a really powerful group of intellectual women who have been in the forefront of feminism from the late 1960s, and they explore the impact of language, subjectivity, and power relations on gender and sexuality. I'm still refining my thesis topic, but the central theory I'm exploring is Judith Butler's theory of gender performativity. Butler is an American literary and gender theorist whose work began in the 1980s and explores the concept of the social construction and performance of gender and sexuality. Butler argues that gender and sexuality are performative in that we learn how to perform our gender and sexual roles through observation and imitation. Butler is considered a post-structuralist, and so to gain insight into the development of her theories, I thought it would be useful to explore those who had come before her. Before I move into an exploration of the French post-structural feminists, it's useful to ask, what is post-structuralism? Now, post-structuralism arose in the 1960s and 70s as a critique to the tradition of structuralism and the idea that there is an underlying logocentric structure to human culture and language. Post-structuralists argued that there is no system of fixed meaning, and instead language and meaning can only be understood in context. Where structuralism suggests that there is an underlying system by which both the signifier and the signified attain meaning, post-structuralists argue that meaning is generated through discourse and through the relationships which exist between each element. This is an important principle for the French post-structural feminists as they sought to disrupt the dominant male discourse and to uncover and promote a feminine position. So let us move to the post-structural feminists, often simply referred to as French feminists, though this is not as accurate and is more of an American terminology. These women were focused on examining the subject positions of man and woman within the structure of language. They challenged what they saw as the phalangocentric nature of the Western world and Western philosophy. Phalangocentric is a word and concept originally coined by Jacques Derrida as a combination of phallocentric, meaning focusing on the male point of view, and logocentric, which is focusing on language and assigning meaning to the world. So a phalangocentric view, therefore, has man as the centre of the world, determining meaning, and everything else is other, perceived only in relation to that centre. The French post-structural feminists argue that this position has been supported by religion, philosophy, and language, and has operated throughout history to oppress and silence women. In a phalangocentric culture, they argue, the world is structured in binary oppositions: man, woman, order, chaos, language, silence, good, evil, where the first term is valued over the second. To challenge and resist this position, then, they sought to explore ways and strategies that women could situate themselves in the world that wasn't just in relationship to men and structured language. I'm going to provide an overview of three of these theorists today: Julie Kristeva, Luce Irigaray, and Hélène Cixous. I think it's interesting that whilst each of them sought to address a common issue, that is, challenging the phalangocentric paradigm, they each applied different analytical frameworks and proposed different strategies for addressing the issues they identified. We'll turn first to Julia Kristeva. One of Kristeva's key concepts is the proposal that signification is comprised of two components: the symbolic and the semiotic. Now, the semiotic, she suggests, is developed pre-language and is the source of our biological drives and relates to rhythm and sound. The semiotic is associated with the feminine, coming as it does before we identify a separate sense of self from the mother. Once this happens, when we develop a separate identity, a process which Kristeva terms as objection, we enter into the realm of language and logic, associated more with masculinity and structure. Jacques Lacan had previously identified the nature of the symbolic. However, where Christina differs from Lacan is that she believes we continue to move between the symbolic and the semiotic. Lacan saw the symbolic as a development stage, and once we had separated from the mother, we stepped into the realm of logic and remained there. I quite like this quote from an article by Laurie Bailey as a way of understanding the difference and the connection between the semiotic and the symbolic. The semiotic comes before the symbolic. It is repressed by the symbolic, but also speaks through and disrupts the symbolic through music, art, and poetry. It is accessing the repressed semiotic that Kristeva argues is the means of reclaiming self and resisting symbolic order. It is in the gaps and silences of the language system that Kristeva suggests there is space for women's language, a language that can challenge and resist male-dominated discourse. In that space, between the body of the mother and the law of the father. However, she also acknowledges that it is not just women who have access to the semiotic, and she cites James Joyce as a male author who disrupted the rules and structures of conventional language, reflecting a more semiotic approach. I now turn to Luce Irigaray. Irigaray had been a student of Jacques Lacan. However, their relationship ended and she was fired from her teaching position when she published a study in 1974 which analysed and criticised the phallocentric bias in Freud and his definition of women as imperfect, castrated men. She argues that women's bodies and sexual pleasure have historically been missing or misrepresented in male discourse, and it is for this reason that this is where women must begin to reclaim and understand her sense of self. She suggests that the complexity and diversity of women's sexuality has been oppressed and made to conform with the singular focus of male logic. Irigaray embraces female difference and associates women's writing with fluidity as opposed to male rigidity. Uncovering and exploring this fluidity and diversity, she argues, is a first but not only step for women in expressing their unique feminine being and experience. One of Irigaray's most well-known critical tools in this process is the concept of mimesis. For Irigaray, mimesis is a process of imperfectly imitating stereotypes about women so as to subvert and undermine those stereotypes. And I thought of a contemporary example of this strategy. For those of you on Twitter, you may be familiar with the Twitter feed or person concept of the man who has it all. In this feed, stereotypical issues that usually apply to women are applied to men. So questions are asked such as, ladies, do you allow your man to work? And if so, how does he juggle work and family? Words such as womankind are defined as gender neutral, referring to both women and men. It's a terrific satire and highlights how ridiculous some of these issues and perceptions are, and yet we continue to unironically apply them to women. So I would suggest that Luce Irigaray's strategy of mimesis is not only alive and well in our culture today, but is still absolutely relevant after nearly 40 years after its inception. And finally, we have Hélène Cixous, most famous for her concept of l'écriture féminine, or feminine writing. Like Irigaray, Sixu believes that women's unconscious is completely different from men's and that it has been repressed and ignored. This, then, is where women must begin. As she opens in her seminal essay, The Laugh of the Medusa, Sixu exhorts that woman must write herself, must write about women and bring women to writing, from which they have been driven away as violently as from their bodies. In writing herself, Sixu argues that women access language differently. Her language does not contain, it carries. It does not hold back, it makes possible. Writing outside the accepted norms, as Sixu herself does in all of her writing, challenges the phallogocentric culture and allows new and more inclusive discourses to be created, outside the masculine discourse within which women have always operated. Sixu connects women strongly to the mother and motherhood, suggesting that women are naturally inclined to produce and create, to bring about life, and that this is in the essential nature of women. I'll come back to this point in a moment, as it is also a source of criticism of Sixu's work. Another important attribute of Sixu is her belief that feminine writing is situated in the body, in the physical self. She asserts that women's bodies have been subjugated and confiscated from them, and that it is through re-experiencing the body through writing that we can reclaim ourselves. She advocates for a celebration of difference rather than a need for control and transformation of difference. In doing so, we can discover and create new approaches to language and literature, writing outside accepted structures and allowing us to write toward truth. I hope I've clearly outlined for you the contribution that these three women, Kristiva, Irigaray and Sixu, have made to feminist and gender theory, and the strong foundation they have provided to examine the position of women in language and literature. They also, particularly Sixu and Irigaray, were a precursor to queer theory, as they acknowledged the diversity of sexuality and argued against the binary nature of the phallogocentric norm. As I mentioned earlier, however, there are, of course, criticisms of these French feminists, both at the time their theories were first proposed and since, as feminism has evolved and developed. We've already heard how Irigaray lost her job as a result of expression of her theories, and in 1980, Sixu was criticised by no less than the French Prime Minister, and her women's studies program was removed from the curriculum of her university. In some respects, I think this just reflects and reinforces the core of their ideas, that the phallogocentric ruling core suppressed and silenced the other. In addition, however, this group have also received criticism from other feminists. Firstly, it has been argued that Sixu and Kristiva's focus on the maternal can be seen to reinforce the glorification of motherhood from which many feminists seek to be alleviated. They argue that there is no empowerment in claiming as virtues qualities that have always been convenient and admired by men, and that this reinforcement just continues to repress the true nature of women. Others argue that the concept of the universal feminine flattens out women's experience and certainly doesn't take into account issues of intersectionality and the differences that women of colour, different social class, culture and sexuality experience. The concept that woman has an essential nature has also been robustly challenged, and it is argued that this does not take into account the acculturation process that women experience, and that what is conceived as the essential nature of woman is actually formed within the sociological and phallogocentric culture in which she is born and raised. And so we loop back to Judith Butler and her theory of gender performativity, where she suggests that gender and sexuality are learned through imitation and performance, and that there is no innate feminine nature. I'll continue to explore these issues through my thesis and also through my own writing. The other area that I hope to explore in my thesis is related to Sixu's command to write yourself. Your body must be heard. This, for me, is critical for women in writing. I have a couple of favourite authors who I think write in this space, and I'd be very interested if any of you have any other recommendations. First, Jeanette Winterson. She's an English author who, in both the content and language of her writing, explores unflinchingly the experience of herself as woman and other. Her debut novel in 1985 was Orange is Not the Only Fruit, and it was a semi-autobiographical novel about a young woman's sexuality and coming out, and it was very progressive for its time. Lydia Yuknavitch is an American author, and her book, The Chronology of Water, is beautifully written from her body. The opening paragraphs about giving birth to a stillborn child are extraordinary. And she goes on to detail her experience and the reclamation of her body following the sexual abuse she experienced as a child from her father. More recently, I think Hannah Gadsby's performance in Nanette is a very important piece of work, not just in how it challenges accepted norms to give voice to diverse experience, but in the beauty and pain of her exploration. She exemplifies the challenges that still exist in our society. We still have a long way to go. I hope you've enjoyed our journey through post-structural feminism. I think it's really useful to understand the historical context in which contemporary theories sit. And it's also useful to see which elements of those theories are still relevant and being used today, and which have evolved over time. So thank you for listening, and please let me know if you have any questions.